Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am very excited to be joined by Jane and Danny, who are two of the students who helped put together the Back to School at Babylonia exhibition that is currently at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. That's the University Museum at the University of Chicago. And they are going to talk to us about the mechanics, really, of how museum exhibitions come together, because I have zero experience in this. I have all kinds of questions. And they very graciously agreed to give us some of their time. So Jane, Danny, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I am going to start out with our usual first question. Longtime viewers will know this. How did you both get into the field, and what are your areas, your special areas of interest? Jane, if you want to start us off.
Sure. Yes, I'm a PhD student, but I got interested in ancient Mesopotamia already as an undergrad, and I took class on literature, and that got me really interested. I think what I really liked about it was that it combined lots of different things that I liked doing. So it was like literature and history and language and culture sort of all together. And I'm definitely a texts person. I really admire archaeologists a lot, but for me, a thing I really loved about it was that by reading, you could sort of find out about this whole world, or reading kind of unlocked this whole world. So I got interested in that. And then I sort of, for a while, was oh, do I want to do social history? I'm interested in gender. And then I was no, I really want to keep working on literature. So I really focus on narrative. And I'm interested in sort of how stories are told. And I'm writing my dissertation right now on time in narrative literature.
That's amazing. And I will absolutely be asking you to come back to talk about time and narrative in ancient literature, because that sounds fascinating. Danny, how about you?
Yeah, well, I'm a third-year undergraduate student, and I kind of got into Assyriology last year a little arbitrarily. I study religious studies and philosophy primarily, and decided I just wanted to take a new language because the University of Chicago offers a lot of really cool languages I'd never heard of, one of which being Akkadian. And I was wow, I have no clue what this is. And I Googled it and looked at the Wikipedia page, and I was oh, this relates to Gilgamesh, and I'd read it before. So I just kind of on a whim decided to join, and then really loved it and decided to take some more classes in it. And now I'm minoring in it.
That's amazing. Akkadian, why not?
For
what
fun.
Undergrad really shouldn't be taking Akkadian? That's wonderful. I have to ask, how are you enjoying Akkadian?
Oh, I took it it was rough, I won't lie, but I loved it a lot. Actually, I had really great teachers. Jane was one of my TAs, actually, and she was wonderful. So it's been really fun.
It's a lot. It is a lot. I'm teaching Akkadian at the moment for a community college. I think we have a couple of my students currently watching, and I think they can probably empathize with Akkadian. It's a lot. It's great, but it's a lot. Okay, so moving on to the exhibition itself. Had either of you worked on any kind of museum work or museum exhibits before? No for Jane, and no for Danny as well?
Yeah, no, never.
Was this something that you kind of envisioned doing as part of your undergraduate or graduate careers, Danny?
Definitely not. I was really lucky. Professor Susanna Paulus, an Assyriology professor here, who's our boss, she was teaching two of my classes in the first quarter last year, both Akkadian and a civilization literature class. And because I was in two of her classes, she suggested I apply to an opening she had to work with her. And I was okay. And it definitely was not something I ever anticipated being part of. I didn't really know much about it when I first started working, but it's been definitely my favorite part of undergraduate experience so far.
Awesome. How about you, Jane?
Yeah, I mean, so when I decided to come to Chicago for graduate school, I knew the tablet collection was part of it, and I wanted to sort of interact with it in some way, but I didn't really. And then there was sort of the pandemic happened, so everything was very remote. But working on the exhibit was a really fun way to sort of get to work with other people in person, and also to work with the objects. So yeah, it was kind of this unexpected opportunity that came up, but it was really fun.
So for people who have never done any kind of exhibit work, like myself, what is the very general process? Where does it start? How long does it take? How do people decide on themes and stuff? Jane, do you want to start?
Yeah. So I'd say that this exhibit, which is sort of open from fall 2023 to spring 2024, I guess the sort of like roots of it go back 3 years ago when Professor Wallace was teaching a Sumerian class that sort of like looked at the progression through the like scribal curriculum in the Old Babylonian period. We're like, okay, like the Isaac tablet collection has a lot of these like tablets from House F, this scribal school. And we were sort of like really interested in the tablets and what they could show and what like recent decades of research had sort of like shown about and like uncovered about the way education worked. So there was sort of like, we were taking this class and she was teaching this class and we all found it really interesting. And then we were sort of thinking about like it was really, Susanna's idea was like, oh, this could be a good sort of special exhibit. And so then it was sort of like 2 years of like a lot of people working in different capacities within like the Isaac Museum and the tablet collection to sort of make it happen. But yeah, I think it was like a good choice for an exhibit because school is such a sort of like thing people can relate to in different ways, like learning to read and write. Those are sort of like things people can connect to easily. And also like, because they're students and they're sort of like bad at some things and good at some things, that's also, I feel like, a very universal phenomenon. But that was sort of like, yeah, so the beginning stages involved doing things like figuring out like, well, what tablets are here that could go in the exhibit, like what sort of state are they in, what texts do they have on them, and what possible sort of like thematic groupings of objects could you do. Like, since we were doing a catalog, they all had to be photographed, which Danny should definitely talk about. But yeah, sort of like what objects from here and then what objects from like the Penn Museum could we potentially borrow was at the first stage. And then kind of like everything became sort of like more and more finalized, like writing about it, like for the catalog, like preparing the actual design and layout of the exhibit itself was also the things that happened next, I guess.
Awesome, thank you. I am going to actually ask Danny to talk about the photographs because I have a beautiful museum catalog here. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. It's lovely, and there's like really great chapter contributions in there, and the pictures and the photographs are beautiful. So I've just got a couple of the pictures that I haven't found in the catalog, but Danny and Jane were kind enough to send me before we started talking. So Danny, what role did you have with the photography?
Yeah, so primarily I was taking photographs of the objects so that my colleagues can edit on top of them, as you can see here, these kind of annotations. It was definitely a stressful time. We had photographs of the objects done, but we got some kind of new technology and new lenses that kind of rapidly increased the quality of the photography. So we wanted to retake all of them. So for all of spring quarters, about 9 weeks, 18 hours a week, I was photographing like all 126 tablets in the exhibit or something. It was a crazy crunch time, but it was an incredible amount of fun. There's like a lot of like balance between wanting to do it kind of artistically and demonstrate the objects in their like most beautiful capacity, but then also making sure that like the inscriptions are really clear, so that, you know, people can use them for scholarly reasons as well.
I have to say, one of the things that is always difficult as an Assyriologist when you're going through photographs is being able to make out what the signs say. And something that my professors always highlighted is that tablets are very much 3D objects. You need to be able to turn them in the light to really see the shadows and see what the signs are. What kinds of lighting did you guys have to use? Was it just like as much light as you could possibly get, or how did that work?
No, it was very challenging, actually, as you're mentioning, because it's like indented. It can be very difficult to get the wedges to show up pretty clearly. We played around a lot with lighting. Primarily, we had like one large source coming from the top left corner to try and help get those wedges have the most contrast. But resultantly, the corners of the edges would be kind of in shadow and it would distort the shape. So we had two secondary lighting sources that are kind of mini ones. They're like little squares. And those you can adjust the hue on them and the brightness. So if a tablet was a little more gray, I would make it a little more warm toned. And I'd have those in the corners kind of working as supplementary lighting as well. And then, of course, like playing around with camera settings, aperture, shutter speed, etc. And then in Photoshop, if needed, you can like, you know, adjust some of the brightness as well. But for the most part, it's really just about patience. I mean, some of the photos took like 45 minutes just to get an obverse photo that we all decided looked really good.
I can absolutely believe that. So once you've kind of chosen the objects that are going to be included in the exhibit, how do you go about preparing them to be mounted, I guess, put in the exhibition space, Jane?
Yeah, so that was a process that involved like working with a lot of the like staff of the Isaac Museum. So it was like once the objects were selected, they all had to go to conservation and be approved to be on display for conservation, like by the conservation team, and also just like checked or like stabilized in various ways. And then yeah, then this was one of the like coolest things about it to me is that like we decided that we wanted the tablets to be sort of displayed on the wall, and that for people to sort of like go up to them and look at them and to have these sort of annotations that are also incorporated into the like the photos in the catalog. But this meant that each of them got their own like bespoke mount, and that was what that like first picture showed, was like Aaron making the mounts. And so every single one of these like over 100 objects got its own like special sort of holder, and then they got like painted to be an unobtrusive color compared to the particular sort of like brownish gray that that individual object was. So yeah, that was just like very impressive. And sometimes when I'm in the exhibit, I'm like admiring a tablet, but I'm also just like admiring the mount. Yeah, so yeah, you can see like they sort of like, yeah, and then they all got lovingly put into the case and again checked by conservation to see like, oh, if there's a sort of tremor, is it going to be okay or not, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was really like a collective effort to get the tablets like looking their best so they could go on display and then like securely put on display. So yeah.
I that was actually a question I was going to ask, because you can see in this photo here that the mounts are a very similar color to the tablets. That was my next question. Did you guys have to actually just sit and paint them all?
So that was not unfortunately something we got to do, but that was definitely something that like the sort of like the people on the prep and design side of things at the museum did. And that just in general, I think was a really fun aspect of seeing the exhibit come to life. Like we sort of collectively chose this sort of like teal color as a kind of nice contrastive color again, because a lot of the objects in the exhibit are this sort of light brown. And it was really fun before it went up to sort of see like, oh, the cases and the like nails in the cases, all of these different things where it had like turned this color. So yeah, so that was just like something that was really cool and gave me like a lot of appreciation for the people who work in the prep and design side of things and the conservation side of things. And that was definitely a cool thing about working like on the exhibit, is that sort of like spend the same like time every day in this building, but often don't really interact. And the exhibit gives us a chance to interact with all these other people who like work in the museum full time.
That's fantastic. Danny, what was your favorite and least favorite part of the process?
Oh, perhaps my favorite part would be just working with our team. I really love everyone on our team. I worked with them both during the school year and stayed to work in the summer as well. And I just really met a lot of people like I never would have worked with before, a lot of other professors. And I've just like generally really enjoyed being part of this community. I think our boss, Susanna, does a really amazing job of creating such a like amazing environment to work in. Some specific projects were more fun than others. Tubi was fun to work on. I don't know if I necessarily have a specific least favorite. It was a lot of work, and the time could be intense, as I mentioned, with the photography. And as Jane was kind of mentioning, needing to have things in mounting, I didn't have very much time to get the photos done because they needed to go down to mounting at certain times or be taken off display, etc. So at times it was perhaps a bit stressful to know I have to get that all done, and like in conjunction with all of my schoolwork too, as a full-time student. But I like truly loved every minute of it. It was really fun, and I enjoyed it. So
It sounds like a really valuable experience.
for sure.
Jane, did you have a specific favorite or least favorite part?
Yeah. I think that like again, the favorite part has to be the sort of like collaboration. A part I really enjoyed is when we sort of like we had like the objects had been selected, but we were sort of like figuring out, oh, how do they form these sort of like thematic or like explanatory groupings? And then like the various like graduate students who were working on it. Some of them are like pictured in those photos, so like myself, but then also Colton Siegmund and Marta Diaz-Ferreira and Madeline Wine. We sort of got like assigned our little group of objects or a single object for the week, and we would like go write about it and then bring it to each other and sort of talk about it collectively in the meeting. And so that was really interesting. It's like, okay, you have 300 words to talk about like the exaltation of Inanna, this like incredibly beautiful and complicated text, and also somehow to highlight the wonderful aspects of our fragment of it in the display, which is this like tiny little bit from one bit of it. So it's fun to sort of like have that writing challenge and then to like bring it to the other people. And I guess, yeah, I mean, the least favorite part, I think like it's like a big project with a lot of moving pieces and involving a lot of like forward thinking, which I'm not always very like good at. Like, oh, this has to be done at this point so I can go to this point and this thing like that. So I guess in a way, one thing it really taught me is that if you're like producing anything, like you will think it is done way before it is actually done. Like you'll feel like you're done and you've done everything. And then like the little bits of the like final part, like making sure everything's consistent and like you called this text to this thing over here, so you have to call it the same thing over here and that kind of thing. That like was very time consuming. And so I guess it's sort of feeling of like, we're done. Oh no, we're not done. It was like a good lesson to learn, I think.
I had the first time I edited a book, I had a very similar experience because the writing was done. I'd edited for content. It was great. And then I realized there are like 3 different heading styles going on in here. In some places I've underlined stuff. In other places I've italicized stuff. I have to go back through and make sure this is all one coherent unit. And doing that for a museum exhibit must have been a very big headache.
Yeah, I mean, and even just things like, how are we going to spell this name, which people don't agree on how to spell and stuff like that. And it's like, well, we just need to like pick something and stick with it and stuff like that. Yeah.
So could you tell us then about the actual exhibit? What is it showing and what kinds of objects are on display? Danny, why don't you start?
Sure. So our exhibit is based on an excavation of a house in Nippur in Iraq called House F, where we found all these school tablets. And it is basically an entire tour, so to speak, of how students learn scribal education. So we start off with kind of at the beginning of the exhibit showing how we as scholars have kind of figured out what their curriculum is and what the archaeological site itself looks like. And then the exhibit kind of transforms into the different exercises the students had, the different topics in school that they learned, and like their progression through the scribal education curriculum, so to speak.
That is really, really cool. And I know that there are some, there we go, some like more interactive features. Danny, could you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, I saw someone had a comment about 3D printing. These are some really cool tablets that we 3D printed and then painted to look like the tablets that are on display. And one of the really cool parts about some of these specific tablets is that they have like squish marks or finger marks dragged through them. So we really wanted these to be 3D printed so that viewers and feelers could have this kind of interaction that showed them that these tablets were something that like real living, breathing humans worked with and interacted with, and the indents and marks in the clay kind of preserve that human aspect. And so through this 3D kind of printing that we mounted on the wall, people can kind of also feel what the tablets are like and see what they look like as well, which is a really cool and I think very unique part of our exhibit.
I had no idea those were 3D printed. Actually, the painting is really good.
Yeah.
And that was going to be my question, like, those can't be real tablets, surely. That's very impressive. Very nice. So, Jane, you mentioned that some objects were borrowed from other museum collections. What's the process for either identifying and then kind of requesting them to be put on display?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like, I think this is also an interesting thing about the exhibit. And I understand you were saying like the opening, focusing on the excavation. Something we really wanted to make clear is like the objects in the museum are from this one excavation, but the objects from that excavation got divided, as was customary in the 1950s when the excavation occurred, between 3 locations of like the Isaac Museum in Chicago, the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and then the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. And so we wanted to find a way to represent like the objects that ended up in these 3 different places, but were once together in this house. And so there are a lot of casts of the tablets here at Isaac. So we use casts for the tablets from Iraq. So we were able to sort of like show like a physical object representing the object, and also to kind of remind people like this object's not here, this object is in Iraq, the country where the objects were found. But yeah, then we were also able to borrow some of the objects from the Penn Museum, which was really exciting because they can sort of like complement art collection, or like the ones that ended up here in Chicago. So I think there were various ones that we sort of knew we wanted to borrow. So for instance, we were able to borrow this sort of like fascinating text called like the Nippur catalog that sort of lists a catalog of compositions and has this like one set of sort of like a fixed feature of the curriculum, the decad, like listed at the beginning. And so that's kind of cool. It's like the Nippur catalog's there, and then the examples of the decad are sort of there on the wall next to it. But yeah, I think we ended up like borrowing about like 15 objects. And so sort of like figuring out what those should be and sort of like trying to have them touch on different aspects and cover things that like the Isaac collection doesn't cover. But those could also be sort of like funny things. So like, I think an inspired idea was to borrow this one particular tablet from the Penn Museum, which is from the school and features the bite marks of a student who like bit into the tablet. And this tablet is like a real highlight with people of all ages. I was just showing it to a group of first graders this morning, and they were sort of like, yeah, some of them were disgusted, some of them were amazed, and stuff like that. So, I mean, on the one hand, we borrowed these like beautiful literary tablets that really show sort of like, oh, like what would a complete version of this object look like? And on the other hand, we like borrowed some objects that sort of reveal everyday life. But yeah, I mean, so that was a sort of like negotiation process of figuring out like, well, what could we borrow? Like, what would sort of be the terms of borrowing it? And then like, I think a thing that is very sort of exciting and feels like it's sort of the most glamorous, I guess, seriology gets is that like, yeah, like some people come bring the like objects, especially on a plane, and they arrived, but we didn't even know exactly like when they had arrived, or like they arrived and we only found out afterwards that they had arrived. And then like they come and they bring the objects like right at the end, and they're there while the objects are put on display. And they sort of like approve how they're going to be on display in these various ways. And then yeah, they'll come back with equal sort of glamorous mysteriousness to take them back in a few weeks.
Sounds a little bit like a diamond heist.
Yeah.
So, Danny, do you have a favorite object in the museum?
Oh, actually,
I'm
the one
aware that's kind of asking, like, do you have
Yeah.
a favorite child?
I do feel like I'm betraying some of them. The object Jane mentioned actually with the teeth marks is one of my favorites. It's actually the object I wrote about in the object descriptions of the catalog, so definitely has a very special place in my heart, and it's just really fun to look at. But I think because I work with the tablets so much from a visual perspective, some of them I just find like really beautiful, and I can't necessarily name them off the top of my head, like their registration numbers. I have that somewhere written down, but there are some tablets that are just so photogenic, so to speak, and really beautiful on camera. There's one that has on the edges of the tablet like a cylinder seal imprint that's very cleanly rolled around, and it's just so beautiful. And it turned out so well on camera, and I was really proud of like how great it looked in the end. So those were really, really fun to work with. Some of the really huge tablets are kind of just like amazing in their entirety as well, because it's just crazy how large and stunning they are. But the teeth marks one is kind of a favorite.
I think that's something that definitely gets lost in translation when you're studying Mesopotamia from books, even when you've got hand copies or drawings of the tablets. If you're just looking at translations, it's really hard to remember that actually these are like physical objects and they have their own, you're right, very unique beauty. Jane, do you have a favorite object?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like some of the ones I like the most are the ones that show sort of like progression of the students getting better. So they're like various types of tablets, either like round ones or these sort of ones that are on the like screen where it's sort of like they're practicing like old material on the back of the tablet and learning new material on the front of the tablet, and then you can sort of like show how they're progressing through the curriculum. But some of my favorite are these sort of like round ones where the teacher writes like 2 lines and then or the more advanced person writes 2 lines and then the student copies them. Because some of them, like the student is really bad at it. And I just find that like very endearing. I'm like, yeah, it is hard. And like, you know, your like angle went in the wrong place and stuff like that. Or like you didn't leave enough room for this sign and now you're sort of squeezing it in at the end. And then what's also fun is that like then we have that same sort of format of tablet from like a bit later on, and like the student there is way better at it. And so it's like, I really like that you can see that sort of progression of their handwriting. So that's really cool. Yeah, so those sort of stand out to me in terms of like tablets from this particular exhibit.
The very early tablets always, I have a 5-year-old, 6-year-old now, and he spent a lot of time writing birthday cards recently. All his class apparently have birthdays in January. And the way that he writes birthday cards reminds me very much of those early tablets, because he like uses half of the card for the first half of his name and then has to kind of scribble very, very tinily the rest of it, or like start a new line. And I'm like, yes, this is children learning to write absolutely everywhere in the whole entire world. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both for answering my questions. We are going to take a very quick 1-minute break. If you, current audience, have questions, please put them in the chat and we will answer those very shortly. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, Jane and Danny. Okay, so we have a selection of questions. The first one comes from my Patreon. Someone is asking about this way, 2P, who we all have currently sitting on various bookcases. I took 2P to the elementary school down the road, and he helped me with career day on Friday. He was a big hit, and my 2-year-olds keep stealing him and running away with him and have christened him the potato. They're 2. They don't understand about cuneiform. They're forgiven for that. But could you tell us a little about who 2P is, how he came to be, and can people buy him online? I don't know who is best to answer this question, so someone jump in.
I can answer it. So I designed and created 2P, which was a
nice
really
job. Very nice job.
Very proud of him. It was a very long process. It was just something I kind of had a vision of about a year ago, a little over a year ago, where I really thought it would be a cool way to engage with a very large audience of people from different demographics. He's inscribed with Sumerian riddle that's also on the like archway of the gallery, or the entrance to the exhibit itself. That's like asking, like, basically like one enters into it blind and leaves it seeing, like, what am I? It's the scribal school. And his name 2P is from the Akkadian word tupum, which means tablet. And yeah, he is available for purchase. The University of Chicago Isaac Museum store online, I believe, is selling them and shipping them. I think the souk is the store. You can definitely search it up and find him, and he is available there, along with a lot of other really cool merchandise from the exhibit, if I do say so. Yes, the children's book is super fun.
The
The
children's book
shirts
was
Jane and
also
I are
a huge
wearing.
hit. Yep, beautiful shirts. Okay, cool. I will put the link in the video description then, because I know there are going to be several people who definitely want to get their hands on Tupi. Awesome. Thank you for that. Next question. Is it true you created a schoolroom for the exhibit?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So, like, this is definitely something we were thinking about is like, how can we have the experience of walking through the exhibit, like, mirror the house in some way? And so it's not like the exhibit space is a little bit bigger than House F would have been, and the like layout of the rooms is not quite the same. But overall, there is a kind of like overlap between sort of like the spaces of the ancient house and the spaces of the exhibit. And we really wanted this feeling of you sort of like enter into it, and you sort of progress from those sort of like little like not particularly well written tablets to these elaborately written tablets. So sort of as you move through it, you're sort of following the journey of a student through it. But yeah, like unfortunately we were not able to just like completely recreate House F on the campus of the University of Chicago, although that would have been great.
That's a shame. Thank you. Same questioner, and we kind of covered this, but if we could just clarify again, are the tablets in the exhibit all originals?
Yeah. So it's a mixture. So on the one hand, you have these sort of like 3D printed, very recently created tablets that you can touch in the exhibit. Then in terms of the ones on display, it's a mixture of original tablets and then casts of tablets that are now in the Rock Museum.
Thank you. And what has the public reaction been to the exhibits?
Wonderful. I think it's been really fun. We've had a lot of tours. Jane mentioned like she gave a tour to a bunch of little kids earlier today. So we've had a lot of cool interaction. Everyone I've given a tour to has really loved it. We've done some tours for other undergraduate students at the university who are studying Gilgamesh in their core classes. And those have been really fun tours as well. So I think it's been a good reaction.
That's really cool. As an undergraduate, it took me far too long to realize there was actually a museum attached to my university. And then I discovered, I was like, why did no one tell me about this? This is amazing. Yes, so that's very cool. Next question. Did your perception of scribal education change after this experience? Jane, why don't you go first?
Oh yeah, that is a really good question. I think that like again, like something about talking to the general public about it, like has really like shown me both like the enormous amount that we know and the enormous amount that we don't know. Like at one point, one of these like undergrad students asked me if they had like gym class as part of school. Like I was like, well, that's never mentioned anywhere. Like there doesn't really seem to be this sort of like a now we all got up and did like jumping jacks. I mean, definitely not, to be clear. Is never mentioned. But yeah, like so it's like things like people want to know like who the students were, and it's like I also want to know who the students were and how long it took them to go to school, and things like that. It's sort of like this odd mixture of like working on it has really shown me like the enormous amount we do know and the enormous amount we can figure out from the tablets, and the way that the tablets, again, we were sort of talking about like appreciating the text as a material object, like the way the material object shows you things about itself has been really cool and like something I've learned. And then it's also just reminded me like, yeah, like you have to ask these sort of other questions about like experience and figure out how you could sort of try to figure that out too.
I think if I was talking to my kids about school in Babylon, the question would be, when was recess? A good question. I don't know. I don't think that's recorded, but it's a good question. Danny, how about you? Do you feel like your understanding of scribal education changed significantly?
Definitely in the sense that I came in with very little understanding of scribal education. When I first joined, it was not a topic I had almost any kind of background knowledge on. But through the process of creating the exhibit and writing for the catalog, I definitely learned a lot. And even now, like when I go through the exhibit, I feel like I'm constantly learning new things. I think one of the best parts and like ways that my perception has changed the most has just been like realizing how advanced some of these like cultures really were. and like nuanced and deep, and how like profound their lives really were. And I think sometimes it's easy as like a modern viewer to kind of like make these ancient figures very like one-dimensional. Like they're just like, oh, that's ancient people and they did their ancient things and they didn't have technology like we do. They don't know anything. But they really were like an incredibly like nuanced and educated society. And I think that really shows through the content they learn in the exhibit or in their curriculum, sorry, and like the stories that they tell and mythology that they study. So that's been really nice.
I think that's a really excellent point, that there's definitely a tendency to kind of say, oh, it was ancient. They believed in like all these weird gods and no one knew what medicine was. Like, well, they didn't know what we know about medicine, but they were doing a pretty good job given the knowledge they had at the time. So Danny, again, what for you is the most interesting thing that you've learned about Babylon, culture, society, people, any of that during this process?
So I have a particular interest in religion, as I mentioned, that's what I study, and especially gender within religion. And one of the projects I did was some research on specifically the way within the scribal education they portray women and gender and how religion kind of impacts that. And that's been an incredibly interesting thing to learn about, is that the students learned about gender roles and they had ideas of like the ideal woman that very much fit into patriarchal standards you would typically conceive of, you know, a housewife, somebody who cooks and cleans well, etc. But the way that the female deities are presented are often almost kind of counteracting that idea of what femininity is, and is a lot more nuanced. A lot of them are powerful and strong and or physically violent even in a way that is different from what we would conceive of, as well as many of the female students going to scribal schools were becoming priestesses. And so there's this really interesting interplay between religion as a means for allowing gender norms to be broken. And that kind of phenomenon was something that I really enjoyed researching and learning more about.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Jane, how about you?
Oh yeah, this was like the most interesting thing I learned. Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like because the exhibit is so focused on like the process of becoming a scribe and learning to write, there's a lot in it about like the cuneiform writing system and the like lexical list tradition and how they sort of got exposed to the lexical list tradition. And that I do think is just like, it's not something I'm like necessarily going to like research myself, but it's something I find really fascinating, like all the different ways you can sort of encode meaning into the cuneiform writing system, and also how they like taught each other that, and those sort of layers I think is really cool. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I like have been trying to learn cuneiform for a long time, and I feel like I'm always learning new things about it and how it works and how you could make it work. And so I think some of that sort of like getting to see how they learned that too, or like thought about it too, is really interesting.
Very nice. Is there a digital version of the catalog, do you know? Or is it a print one only?
I believe there is a digital version.
Fantastic.
So I think there's two different options. Like you can buy an ebook. If you do that, you get like high quality images of Danny's beautiful photography. But also the case that all Isaac publications have like an open access free PDF that is like not, the images are not quite so sharp, but so that's also available for free on the Isaac website, like all Isaac publications are.
Okay, thank you. So I will find links, if you're watching afterwards, I will find links and put all of those below. Love to see museums and universities putting out open access publications. Excellent news. We have, I think, 3 more questions and then we're going to call it a day. What do you think of Babylonian teaching methods? Would this be a good way, do you think, for children to learn how to be scribes?
Some things that, I mean, they were bilingual, I think, which is a particularly cool part of their education, is they were speaking colloquially, at least in the house. We were studying Akkadian, but also learned to write in Sumerian. And I think bilingual education is really cool, and that students should be learning different languages nowadays too. I think it's good for like brain development. Other ways in which they learn, I don't know if I have the right to speak on, if like from a writing perspective, if that's good for children, but I like the bilingual aspect of it. I think teachers were a lot harsher. I think there was like a tablet and that talks about like like a teacher smacking one of the kids for not doing well on an assignment. So that's definitely not great to implement in our schools, to say the least.
Jane, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, so in this like satirical story about school life, school days that Danny is mentioning, it's like, yeah, anytime the child does anything wrong, he gets hit. And so, I mean, but again, like that definitely not good pedagogy. On the other hand, also like presumably a semi-exaggerated story, and it's a little hard to know. So yeah, there's sort of these like stories that like tell about school life, or these debates that reflect school life, and those are really fun. I love when the scribes like diss each other for having bad handwriting and things like that. But again, it's like have obviously kernels of historical truth, but what they are is a little confusing. And it's something I admire about the curriculum is how like literary it is, which is obviously like aligned with my own interests. But I think it's cool that they like studied so many sort of like beautiful and different from each other texts as part of the advanced part, even if only like some of them got to that stage. I still think like that is a really interesting, like well-rounded humanities education.
Thank you. I've one more question for Jane and then one for Danny, and then we'll let you guys go. Jane, what do we know about the students along the lines of like age, socioeconomic status? What percentage of the population maybe would be going to scribal school?
Yeah, that is a great question, and one that like people have really tried to answer in various ways. So like, again, there are those sort of like stories of school life in which you sort of get the sense of like the school child is somebody whose mother makes their lunch and then they go off to school. And then this like tablet I mentioned with the like bite marks on it, it's like people have to sort of investigate age, like got taken to a dentist who declared it was the bite marks of a 12-year-old. But again, it's like exactly what to do with that information is sort of hard to know. So the tablets typically are not signed and typically not dated, so you can't tell how long it's taking someone to go through the curriculum. And you also like, again, it's like their gender is a little bit unclear. We like tend to assume most of them were male. There's evidence for female scribes as well, or like private students and then scribes. And then in terms of like socioeconomic status, we do think that this was like a fairly elite profession, and that people would go sort of like to a house in their local neighborhood. So these people who lived in the scribal quarter around the Acor temple to the god Enlil in Nippur, and who like may have gone on to careers in the temple and have had parents who were like working in the temple. But yeah, a lot of this is like speculative based on these little bits of evidence and then trying to piece together a picture.
Thank you. Danny, I suspect the answer here is going to be I don't know, but I'm going to ask anyway. Do we know if any of the students were left-handed?
Oh, man. I don't know.
I don't even know how we'd work that one out. Yeah.
A better answer for this.
I do know that like in the past, people have assumed that you had to be right-handed, but now people are beginning to rethink that. Yeah, I mean, like several of the members of our curatorial team are left-handed, including the person who like made the little video like showing how to write a clay tablet that's featured in the exhibit. It's certainly like, I think people used to think, oh, maybe it's not possible in terms of smudging and so forth to write with your left hand, and now think people are starting to think, oh, maybe that's not true. But yeah, needs more study, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you both. Thank you, audience, for your questions. Thank you, Danny and Jane, for your time. This was really, really wonderful and very interesting. If people watching are interested in the exhibit, it runs through mid-March, I believe, of this year. So that's 2024. If you're in or around Chicago between now and the middle of March, definitely go and take a look. And yeah, join us next time, I guess. I don't have a date for the next interview because I'm still scheduling them. But thank you all very much for watching, and we will see you soon. Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.